Alas, poor Yorick. I knew him, Horatio. Hi, I'm Dr. Yorick Campbell, and this is my buddy Yorick. As you may be able to tell, Yorick is dead. Why did he die? Difficult to say. Possibly he died in an epidemic, of the sort that seemed to ravage our species on a fairly regular basis. Perhaps he even died of influenza in 1918. For that is what we are here to discuss. In particular, to ask the question, was the Great Influenza Epidemic of 1918 B.S.? Let's find out. The first indications of influenza in 1918 showed up in Haskell County, Kansas in January, inspiring a local county doctor to report to the U.S. Health Service that he suspected there was a particularly nasty case of flu that might cause an epidemic. Nothing was ever done about it, and it seemed to fade away for a while. A couple of months later, flared up again, where this time in March, it immediately sickened some 500 soldiers and killed about 48, and began to spread from there. One of the things about this epidemic was that it was pretty intimately tied to the prosecution of the latter stages of World War I. It started in the United States, began to spread in army camps among mobilizing troops who were living in close quarters, often with pretty poor sanitary conditions, so spread well. And from there, a lot of these guys were loaded onto ships, often inadvertently infected soldiers who, they weren't showing any symptoms. They were packed on ships, sent across the ocean, and from there it spread to the battlefields of Europe, to Britain, France, Belgium, hopped sides in World War I as well, and sickened German soldiers. May have had something to do with blunting Erich Ludendorff's last offensive in the spring of 1918. And from there gradually spread on ship lines throughout the rest of the world, Africa, Asia, Latin America, becoming a genuinely global pandemic. All things considered, this outbreak of disease by the numbers was the worst in all of history. We are talking most conservative estimate, killed 20 million people, which would have been twice as many as World War I. Kind of a moderate estimate pegs the number at 50 million. The upper end, perhaps as many as 100 million. There are indications that the total death toll may have been undercounted outside of the Western world, where it tended to have more of an impact. Of American citizens, so people from the United States, this killed 675,000 Americans. In October of 1918 alone, nearly 200,000 American citizens died, making that the grimmest month in all of American history. So this was a big, big deal. Ultimately, what was causing all of this was indeed a variant of the influenza virus. Doctors at the time didn't necessarily know that. They suspected it, but research had some difficulty confirming it. A variant of the H1N1 virus, which is basically a gruesome little protein that replicates very easily, gets passed from person to person. And generally flu bugs mutate really easily. So it's difficult to build up immunities to a particular strain when it takes on new qualities. And it tends to be the case that a flu virus either is very contagious, but relatively mild, or really, really lethal, but not terribly contagious. Every now and again, though, in general, a couple of times a century, you will hit upon a variant that is both highly contagious and exceptionally lethal. And the one in 1918 was probably the worst of all. So, the symptoms of this infection: high fever, chills, excruciating body aches. Some who were stricken with the disease reported feeling as though their bones were actually cracking. So that part, and that was just the beginning, was pretty nasty. Then chest congestion would develop, hacking cough. As the body struggled to get oxygen, people could suffer from cyanosis, as they could not get enough oxygen to their bloodstream. Their skin would turn a bluish tint, and often dark blue during this era. Like this was really bad stuff. One of the ways in which the disease was most lethal was that it could provoke an immune system overreaction, what's sometimes referred to as a cytokine storm, that the presence of the virus in the lung tissue caused an immune system overreaction, and lymphatic fluid and stuff like that would flood the lungs, and just basically kind of burn them out. And people just drowned in the fluid in their lungs, and it could happen very, very rapidly. Also, even if they recovered from that, secondary infection with pneumonia was often a problem with this as well. So this was really, really bad stuff. Among the worst parts of it, of course, like we mentioned the overall mortality, but most flu viruses, to the extent that they are lethal, they do most of their damage among the very young, so babies and children under 2, or the very elderly, especially people with heart and lung disease and stuff like that. So the mortality rate, if you do it on a graph, it charts like a big U, with the mortality over the young, the old. The 1918 influenza, instead of a U, was kind of a W. That it did, you had the very young and very old who were struck by it, but also there was a cohort of people in the prime of life. So we're talking age 20 through age 40. The people who usually suffer the least from influenza, who were struck down by this. So people really just beginning their productive lives were cut down in a swath by this. By some estimates, 5, maybe as much as 8% of the global population of young adults was killed by this. So, I mean, really awful stuff. And to give you like some idea of the ultimate spread of this and the course it took, it came in 3 waves. Spring of 1918, it was nasty, but ultimately mortality levels weren't that high. It ebbed a bit during the summer, as influenza sometimes does, but came back with a vengeance in the fall of 1918. And by that point, the virus had mutated, so it was already a bad strain. It was even more lethal, and that's when it did most of its damage worldwide. A good proportion of the people who died in this epidemic died between the months of September and December of 1918. And then there was one final burst of infection in the winter of 1919, before it ebbed a bit for the time being. And obviously the disease itself was bad enough, but efforts to control it illustrated it was going to be bad anywhere it struck, but there was a right way and a wrong way to do this. Particularly notorious, the spread of the influenza in Philadelphia. There, the director of public health was a guy named Wilmer Cruson, who, as the infection started to spread in army bases near the city, continually downplayed it. Said, there's no problem, trying to keep people from panicking. So continually said, look, it's just the flu, just la grippe. It's nothing to worry about. And infections have already started to ebb. Numbers are going down, when that was not at all true. And ultimately, the crowning sort of achievement of idiocy in this particular instance was when the city of Philadelphia went ahead and held a Liberty Bond parade in late September, despite knowing that the infection was spreading and that people needed to be essentially kept out of public. They went ahead with it to try and keep up spirit for the war, which was in its final stages. And within the space of 72 hours, infection cut a swath through the city of Philadelphia. Some 2,500 people were dead within a week, and thousands and thousands and thousands of people infected. So the mismanagement by public authorities of this infection is really what allowed it to spread. We can see that because there are some examples of people who did it right. St. Louis is often held up as one of those. There, the director of public health, a guy named Dr. Max Starkloff, as soon as he received reports of infection in the vicinity of St. Louis, within a couple of days, shut everything down, told people to stay home, closed the bars, the restaurants, the pool halls, the movie theaters, kept people out of public gatherings as much as possible. And even that didn't prevent the influenza from spreading, but it did help it from being as bad as it was in other places, like Philadelphia, like New York, like Boston, which had much less successful public health policies. And there, at its worst, the rate of infection was about 1/8 of what it had been in Philadelphia. So it was always going to be bad. Public health policies could keep it from being worse. So ultimately, I think that's the number one set of lessons if we're looking for anything from the global influenza epidemic of 1918. And obviously, I'm a historian. I am not a public health professional. I am not a doctor. I am not a scientist. I am not an expert in any of those things, but that's perhaps the number one lesson to take away from it is you need to listen to those people. Obviously, doctors can make mistakes, but they know more about it than you do. These are the guys who have the best chance of giving good advice for how to blunt the spread of a pandemic. So the public needs to listen to those guys, and particularly the politicians need to listen to those guys. Secondarily, politicians need to tell the truth to people living in a society. Without honest information that is being given to the public to help them make wise decisions and to minimize unnecessary risk. Bullshitting the public is one of the things that helped the 1918 influenza to be as lethal as it was. Keep saying it was lethal and it was always going to be lethal, but human stupidity made it more lethal than it needed to be. So listen to doctors, tell the truth about pandemics. And above all, act quickly. You can see that there really was a difference in outcomes between places that made quick decisions to minimize public gatherings and unnecessary social contact, instituted social distancing policies, and those that dragged their feet because they didn't want to hurt the local economy. The more quickly and decisively public health departments acted, the better the outcomes were. So those are the main lessons, ultimately. If you're looking for reading about this, probably the best book, sort of the definitive study, and where most of the information that I've just been conveying came from, is John M. Barry's The Great Influenza, published in 2006. Very detailed description of this epidemic. Also, if you want more of a kind of personalized account, the short novel by Katherine Ann Porter, Pale Horse, Pale Rider, gives a pretty harrowing description of what it was like for people to be sick with this illness. And ultimately, these sorts of things are going to happen from time to time. It is just part of life on planet Earth. And as I record this video, we've got ourselves something of a pandemic going on in the year 2020. Perhaps if you were watching this in the future, say 2021, 2022, you're looking back and going, oh boy, that wasn't as bad as we feared it would be, but stuff is kind of tense. And it would be less tense if people in the year 2020 weren't making some of the same goddamn mistakes that they made 100 years ago. History only provides a guide if people are willing to learn from it. If people keep doing the same dumb shit and refuse to learn from history, then we're all sort of screwed. It's not a comforting thought, but I suppose, a historian's job is not to offer comfort, but to offer context. So, ultimately, the verdict on this, the Great Influenza Pandemic of 1918, definitely not BS. It was the real deal, and perhaps the worst one of these in all of human history, worth taking a look at to make sure that we don't make those same mistakes again. Alrighty, thanks. Bye.